Why does it often happen that we can follow an explanation well up to a certain point and then, suddenly, we lose the thread because what we heard at the beginning of the exposition has slipped our minds? Why is it that when we study a text we often have to go back to the previous pages because we have forgotten what we read a few minutes earlier? Why do we easily get confused when we are given too many directions? And why does this happen even when we are focused and motivated? This happens because our ability to acquire a lot of information at a time has limits that are physical, biological, and seemingly insurmountable. Fortunately, however, our brain has an extraordinary capacity to exploit its own plasticity, and with an adaptive effort finds a way to circumvent these limitations imposed by nature. This is all tied to the concepts of chuck and chunking. Generally, the term chunk refers to a single unit of information, while chunking refers to the process of acquiring it. More precisely in the educational field, when we talk about chunking we are referring to both the process of breaking up the contents of the lesson which is used to facilitate learning by the students. That the aggregation of scattered information into complex units that include them and make them more manageable also for long-term memory purposes. Thanks to Miller's studies we know at least two things about human limitations in acquiring and memorizing information. That on the one hand we can only acquire 7 plus or minus 2 at a time. But that on the other hand we can integrate them into higher-level conceptual units and increase the amount of knowledge acquired, without exceeding the limit of 7 plus or minus 2. For example, if we read the number sequence 34500776614 and try to repeat it out loud after a few seconds pause, many of us will probably have difficulty remembering it in its entirety. But if we group the numerical sequence into separate units 34500776614, perhaps playing on the resulting sound effect, it will be easier to remember them precisely because we have integrated and reduced the number of information units, i.e. the chunks that we have to manage. There are many examples showing how we ritually use chunking to aggregate individual components into subordinate concepts. Let's think about the word hand. It may seem obvious, but we do not refer to this part of our body using the sequence of names that identify its components: thumb, index finger, middle finger, ring finger, little finger, palm, back. But we use a term, hand, which includes and integrates the names of its various organic components. This example can also be useful because it allows us to grasp the most intriguing aspect of the chunk subsumption, that is, the possibility of bringing a specific concept back into the context of a more general concept that includes it. As one can easily imagine, all of this has enormous implications on the educational training level because this ability of the brain to integrate simple information into superordinate units allows for the gathering together of masses of scattered details into overall configurations, and for the bidirectional management of knowledge from the particular to the general, and from the general to the particular. Let's see how chunking works with a history text. Let's try to summarize it by making the summary sentences concepts to which all the details of the portion of text from which they derive can be traced back. But let us now try to go one step further. Let us try to integrate the three syntheses into a single subsumptive logical proposition. As can be seen from the three colors, each component of the final sentence is nothing more than a synthesis of the summaries of the original text. So, to recap, what did we do? Following the logic of chunking, we integrated the various sentences with all the details into shorter propositions that nevertheless contain them on a conceptual level. But we didn't stop there. We ensured the possibility of going back from the general to the particular, from the synthesis to the detail, making all the logical steps visible. when we talk about the process of comprehension and about the text comprehension tests normally used for this purpose, two contrasting theoretical positions emerge. Let's see them through this hypothetical dialogue. Teacher 1. I have at least 8 students who are insufficient in the reading comprehension tests. If they don't understand, that's their problem. I must evaluate their ability to understand. Teacher 2. For me, however, it makes no sense to evaluate certain abilities to understand a text. If a student does not understand a new text, there are two possibilities. Either he lacks the basic prerequisites and therefore we must provide them with ourselves, or the text was written badly. Said in other words, for some, the process of understanding is a skill to be evaluated, unrelated to the study process. For others, instead, it is a skill to be built through work on the method. These are clearly two contrasting positions. In the first case, one does not intervene and limit oneself to evaluating a process, while in the second, one intervenes on the educational training plan to optimize the results. The first case has no formative implications, it is only an evaluation. The second has at least two. You need to know what happens during the comprehension process, and secondly, you need to know what to do to intervene in the process and improve it. Essentially, during the process of understanding, two events occur simultaneously. Assimilation, that is, the incorporation of knowledge into a pre-existing scheme, and accommodation, that is, a modification of that same scheme to acquire the new knowledge. More precisely, operations and processes such as those indicated below take place. Operations of dismantling and reassembling the text, processes of decoding, categorization, comparison, synthesis, which conclude with a syntactic-semantic restructuring of the text. But be careful, because assimilation can only occur if the schemes at our disposal are complex enough to allow for accommodation to the new situation. And we must not forget that we cannot assimilate something that is not known if past assimilations have not prepared our cognitive structure to accommodate new material. To better understand the nature of the process, let's analyze a hypothetical situation of a comprehension test given on a reading that talks about travel. In the example, let's assume that on one side there is student 1 who has been traveling since he was little and therefore is familiar not only with the situation but also with the specific vocabulary typical of travel contexts by plane, ship, train, terms such as check-in, booking, etc. And on the other side there is student 2 of a lower socioeconomic background who instead is less familiar with the situation and specific vocabulary because he does not travel. It is evident that student 1 has more suitable mental schemes to approach the text, in technical terms, to accommodate himself to it, than student 2 who does not know certain terms and consequently is unable to reconstruct all the meanings present in the text. Student 1, therefore, assimilates the content read with a certain ease while student 2 assimilates little of what he reads. In conclusion, the first student passes the comprehension test well while the second one makes many mistakes. Student 1's past experiences helped him get a good evaluation. Student 2 received a negative evaluation not due to lack of effort, but because he was unfamiliar with travel and the text. Let us now briefly come to the second point of our reflection, that is, what we can do to intervene in the comprehension process and improve it. The first thing to do is to give everyone the same cards before starting a comprehension test on a new text. Of course, with some specifications. In fact, if the text is new but refers to a topic of study already covered, it is obvious that we expect the student not to arrive unprepared for the test. The typical situation of many comprehension tests in which the test focuses on a topic that is outside the curriculum of the subject is quite different. In this case, it is mandatory to verify that all students have the prerequisites of knowledge and skills necessary to understand it, to avoid incurring the errors shown previously, as the two teachers in our hypothetical example point out in the next screenshot. In this lesson, we cover two basic concepts, skill and competence, and how we can build a competence from a skill without confusing the areas of meaning. In fact, these are two concepts that often recur in curricular planning and whose implications determine the nature of the proposed training activities as well as the expected results. The starting point of the reflection is the double observation that in common language the two terms often have overlapping meanings, but that at a scientific level the boundaries between the two semantic areas must be defined precisely. Among the many definitions of ability, we refer to the one provided by Reed in 1969 which, although dated, describes its basic characteristics precisely. According to this researcher, ability is the learned capacity to achieve predetermined results with maximum certainty, often with a minimum expenditure of time or energy or both. In particular, a behavior is considered able if these 5 elements are present. Speed, due to the elimination of superfluous processes, activities, movements. Trust, linked to an increase in familiarity with the performance. Anticipation, linked to the ability to think ahead and thus anticipate subsequent data. Automation, linked to the associated decrease in conscious control. Irregularity, i.e., the ability to display skilled behavior even under unfavorable conditions. But if we remove the term ability from the diagram and write the term competence in its place, we discover that the characteristics of skilled behavior also apply to competent behavior. But then where is the difference? What is different about competence that differentiates it from ability? In literature there are many answers. Here we offer our. We consider competence as the ability to use a skill in a new or unexpected context. The implementation of a skillful behavior in such situations allows to verify more accurately the level of actual mastery reached by the user. The contexts to be prepared for such verification can be various and different. A familiar but much more complex and articulated situation. You are good at solving problems in plane geometry, now let's try with a solid one. A totally new but not particularly anxiety-provoking situation. You work in a supermarket and you have learned how to use the cash register. Now, knowing that it is rush hour, let's try it with 2 customers who have trolleys full of shopping and are in a hurry. An unexpected and emotionally intense situation. You have demonstrated that you have learned the landing maneuver very well in the flight simulator. Today we propose that you apply them in situations of stress or failure. But at this point the question arises spontaneously. Should we limit ourselves to evaluating the skills as is usually done, or is it also possible to build them, making them emerge from the abilities? The answer is yes, we can do it by transforming the logical space that exists between the two concepts into a design space in which to operate through strategies. We have identified 3. Cognitive transfer, transcoding, recontextualization. Cognitive transfer, that is, the phenomenon by which something previously learned can be extended to a subsequent learning activity. For example, you have learned the rules and theorems of plane geometry and now try to apply them to the geometry of solids. Transcoding, that is the ability to spontaneously restructure in different ways a certain knowledge as an adaptive response to changes in situation. For example, after reading a poem you are asked to represent its contents through a drawing for which each stanza of the composition is transformed, that is transcoded, in graphic form as an image. Recontextualization, that is, the assignment of new contexts of meaning to the contents learned, such that the same configuration acquires different identities depending on the contexts in which it appears. The classic example that explains the concept under examination comes from psychology. A patient suffering from neurosis is helped during the psychotherapy session to construct new contexts of meaning so as to be able to read his experiences from a point of view that does not cause anguish. In conclusion, we can say that arranging situations in which we are asked to use the acquired knowledge to transfer it to other contexts, to recode it in other languages, or to change the point of view from which it is read stimulates the knowledge itself to refine itself at a metacognitive level. In doing so, new performances are generated that transform ability into competence. Let's start from the assumption that what we communicate is always mediated, filtered, distorted by emotions, affections, fantasies, defense mechanisms, and that the emotional affective conditions of an individual always influence cognitive functions. For this reason, managing one's emotional state is one of the most difficult tasks for a human being to carry out, and the teaching process is also strongly influenced by it. It is now well known how anxiety, stress, and tension affect learning processes both when they manifest themselves in excess and when they do so in the opposite direction. We know that high levels of anxiety lead to a reduction in the ability to remember, to lower levels of concentration, to an increase in the sense of fatigue, just as too low levels of emotional involvement lead to apathy, passivity, and indifference. Is it possible to act on the emotional states of those who are learning to make them functional to a profitable acquisition of knowledge? Certainly. It is a matter of acting on the emotional affective variables to generate willingness to learn. That is, to create a mental space ready to welcome the exercise of cognitive functions. You can leverage psychological variables such as curiosity, surprise, humor, cognitive dissonance, extrinsic motivations such as external reinforcements, the need to belong to a group, or you can leverage didactic variables such as highlighting the emotional resonances of the content or focusing on certain problematic aspects of the topic in question. But very often this is not enough and other strategies need to be introduced. The particular lever that we want to highlight here is emotional involvement through simulation contexts. That is, the use of hypothetical scenarios that present situations that have a more or less high emotional significance and act as a vehicle for the transmission of content. We provide 2 examples for this purpose. In the first case, let's assume a lesson on the Middle Ages in which, during a traditional explanation, an emotionally charged situation is inserted at a certain point, which, by leveraging mechanisms of projective identification, intends to make you feel emotions. To begin, imagine you are a knight visiting a nearby fiefdom whose lord is reputed to be very authoritarian. At a certain point, you see a group of very agitated serfs coming towards you and stopping you to talk to you. You are a little wary because you are in a foreign land and you do not know the true intentions of these peasants. But they begin to talk and assert their reasons. They talk about abuses and wickedness on the part of the local lord and ask you to do something. What do you answer to their pleas? Describe it in a text. Let us now reflect on this teaching proposal. What have we done? With our imagination we have simulated a time jump in a scenario in which the student identifies with the condition of the peasants, experiences emotions as if he were really there with them and is called upon to solve their problem. In the second example, we refer to a training lesson on a new product intended for insurance agents. It simulated a situation in which the insured was experiencing particularly difficult personal events, and the agent had to juggle between the strict application of certain rules and identification with the client's experience that led him to propose conditions that were disadvantageous for the insurance company. Through the trick of projective identification, users were asked to delve deeper into the analysis of insurance guarantees and to formulate a policy proposal. In doing so, The study of insurance guarantees was charged with emotional values that somehow accelerated its assimilation on a cognitive level. The concept of recursion is defined in various ways. Let's look at some of them as examples. In philosophy, the nesting of things within things. A story within a story, comments in brackets inside comments in brackets. In computer science, an algorithm expressed in terms of itself. In mathematics, a proof that in the procedure makes use of the thesis that must house. In music, certain compositions with writings that nest in other writings such as the Bach's fugues. In art, Escher's famous paintings such as drawing hands. The question arises whether the use of recursion can be useful in teaching. The answer is yes, and we will see how. But first, a premise is needed that places a scientific basis to our proposal. In a 1972 experiment, two researchers, Bransford and Johnson, established that a picture shown before a text that talks about its contents has the ability to aggregate the parts of the text into a meaningful unit and influence its memory. In the example below, a scenario related to the Industrial Revolution is shown just before the text that goes into more detail about its contents. We know from the Bransford and Johnson experiment that this configuration facilitates the understanding of the contents and their long-term retention because it constitutes the logical anchoring pivot. This premise is the basis of our discussion, but it is not enough. We know in fact that the scenario is structured around 10 points of attention to which we have matched the 10 conceptual nodes explained in the following pages of the text. The fact that each number in the scenario corresponds to a block of text that explains it is fundamental because it creates that image-word connection that induces a recursive type of reading in which I read what I see, and I see what I read. If at first glance it is a reading modality that can be disorienting because it is non-linear, upon closer examination it reveals its main added value. It is a modality that allows you to examine the detail without losing sight of the overall vision and vice versa. But the aggregating power of the recursive ring is appreciated even more as the study progresses. The more one advances with the reading, the more a sort of spiral circuit is consolidated in which three cognitive processes feed each other thanks to the very structure of the format. Representation of meanings, repetition of the represented constructs and integration of semantic networks are facilitated by the anchoring to a system calibrated on a multilevel communication syntax. The presence of a conceptual map instead of the image scenario does not change the substance of the discussion that much. It is true that an image is worth 1,000 words, but a network-type knowledge structure can also work just as well as long as it is isomorphic to the text. That is, the concepts contained in it are exactly and exhaustively represented in the network structure shown. Each conceptual node corresponds to the relative block of text. To explain the principle of figure-ground organization, let's start with an example. A text is presented in two different ways. On the left without particular attention to layout, and on the right, on the contrary, according to criteria of spacing, highlighting and balancing of the parts. As you can see, the visual effects are very different and the reason is easy to explain. On the left, they are limited to going to the next line every now and then, but the text is crowded into a single block, while on the right each conceptual node is separated from the others thanks to a white space to be perceived as an autonomous unit, while the key words are clearly highlighted to direct the reader's attention to what is most important. Furthermore, there are sequences of bullet points that make the reading progression easier. Therefore, on the one hand we have a layout that helps the perception of the conceptual architecture of the text. Whoever wrote it shows consideration for the reader because he wants to put him in the best conditions to identify the crucial points of the text and make it easier for him to reconstruct the syntactic semantic content he is expounding. On the other hand, we have someone who has not done this careful layout work, thus hindering the reading of the text, especially for those who have greater difficulty understanding or are unfamiliar with the topics presented and are less accustomed to using certain terminologies. In short, we can say that the text on the right was written respecting the principles of the so-called figure ground organization. Let's see in detail what it is. It is possible to identify a first level of analysis of the figure ground organization principle, which has been studied in particular by Gestalt theorists. Looking at the composition of the page, one immediately gets the perception of the blocks of words in the foreground compared to the uniform white background behind the text. Thus, one has the perception of the keywords in bold standing out in the foreground over the other words which instead form an undefined background. Note how the text blocks and keywords are perceived as closer than the white background, and the other words appear further away. The fact is that all these precautions succeed in guiding the reader's eye towards the crucial points of the discussion. As a result, there is a rapid identification of both the most important elements of the perceptual field and the secondary ones. In addition to the aspects related to ocular perception that we have just examined, it is possible to identify a second level of analysis of the figure ground organization principle that has been studied by various authors over the years. The cognitive level. Anyone who has the patience to look at the extracts shown on the right will be able to notice a particular use of written language. The use of keywords combined with background words, that is, words that surround the highlighted ones but are intentionally less important, often redundant, sometimes even colloquial. The intention, more or less conscious of the author, seems to have been precisely that of having used them as a contour to create a cognitive contrast between what is in the foreground and what is in the background. In practice, a cognitive use of the figure background organization. In conclusion, we can say that respecting the principles of figure ground organization leads to a reduction in ambiguities due to layouts that are too flat and monotonous or, on the contrary, too rich in confusing elements, which represents not only a desirable communicative attention but also a dutiful service for those who are, so to speak, less equipped in terms of understanding. Let us first read a well-known definition of schema on which our arguments are based. The schema is that hypothetical mental structure in which some fundamental notions are organized in a series of relations that allow us to assimilate new knowledge or to accommodate pre-existing knowledge to new ones. Let us now discover what is the characteristic of the schema that makes it malleable and plastic. It is the ability to evaluate its own adequacy to the processed data and, consequently, to modify itself to adapt to reality. Researchers who have studied the issue have defined 3 types of malleability plasticity, each of which is linked to a specific learning modality: growth learning, fine-tuning learning, and restructuring learning. The first occurs when new knowledge fits into existing schemas and expands them. For example, my airplane schema expands when I learn how to start the device that military fighter bombers have to be refueled in flight. The second occurs when patterns can evolve or change to better match experience. For example, after studying the concept of lift, in relation to the wings of a traditional airliner, I refine that concept as I gain new knowledge about delta-wing aircraft. The third finally occurs when a given reality puts us in the condition to create new schemes by tracing them on existing schemes or deriving them from experience. Let's look at this last case in more detail through an example. What is this aircraft? Is it a plane or a helicopter? Let's take a good look at it before answering. Usually, the image evokes the 2 schemes that almost all of us have in memory. That is, the airplane scheme and the helicopter scheme. In practice, based on our knowledge of aeronautics, the activated schemes will be more or less these. Scheme airplane: elongated cockpit, landing gear, front cockpit, wings, propellers. Propellers. Yes, but they should not be pointing upwards. So, this aircraft is not a real airplane. It has a feature that does not fit into the canonical categories. Helicopter diagram: upwards propellers, landing gear, long cockpit, Someone may remember the shape of certain large military transport helicopters, but it has wings like an airplane. So, it's not a real helicopter. But if it's not a real plane and it's not a real helicopter, what is it? At this point, the two schemes we have in our memory are inadequate to explain the reality we are faced with. This aircraft is a third thing compared to an airplane or a helicopter and probably also has a name that distinguishes it from both. The two memory schemes, if they want to be adequate to the sensitive data and to account for this aircraft, must transform themselves and give rise, through restructure generation, to a third scheme which incorporates and integrates the characteristics of the other two and which has its own specific name. Indeed, that is the case. And the third scheme has its own name: convertiplan. In conclusion, let's see what the implications of our analyses can be on the didactic formative level. Knowing that the patterns that each of us has in our memory are plastic and malleable allows us to plan educational formative interventions that act on the one hand towards the genesis of cognitive structures that lead to intellectual development and on the other towards the creation of forms of knowledge that favor emancipation from ignorance. All of this, obviously, in function of a growth of the person in his entirety. Let's look at this graph that represents a hypothetical process of acquiring knowledge. We start from a basic level of ignorance and, after a suitable period of study, we arrive at a first partial increase. At a certain point, you reach a level of maximal or submaximal mastery. The increases seem to decrease, plateau effect. What happens, however, if instead of stopping the process, you decide to continue with the repetitions of the teaching material? We enter the so-called overlearning phase, during which the continuous repetition of the material beyond the presumed point of maximum acquisition further refines the degree of mastery. The increase is explained precisely by the effect of the reiteration processes that significantly improve the retention in memory of the acquired material. Hilgard, 1953. This is true first of all for the acquisition of sensorimotor skills. Think of certain activities such as swimming, skating, riding a bicycle that are generally learned during youth well beyond the limit of simple acquisition and are repeated many times through play or sports. But it is also true for the learning of abstract knowledge that occurs in the usual study processes, from school to university and beyond. Is it possible to quantify the nature of this increase? Yes, it is. In fact, an increase in mastery levels has been found experimentally with a moderate amount of overlearning, more precisely 150%. However, the continuation of the reiteration process has surprisingly provided evidence in contrast. Progress does not continue indefinitely but, at a certain point, stops, and starting from an overlearning of 200%, no significant increases are recorded. Kruger, 1929. Despite some critical positions, Taylor, 2005, most authors still consider the side effects of superlearning to be very valid, such as, for example, the increase in the discriminability of new meanings learned, the reduction of the risk of forgetting, Ausubel, 1968, or the familiarization with the objects of study with a relative reduction of the cognitive load, Pasquale-Leone, 1980, Case, 1985. At this point in our reflection, it seems intuitive how the advantages of superlearning are especially appreciable in a certain phase of the knowledge acquisition process, that is, just before an exam or a test when the student has already reached a good level of preparation and only needs to refine his skills or maintain them at high levels. The discussion is not so different from what happens in the sports field with sensorimotor skills. We work on refining the athletic gesture when we are already at submaximal performance levels. It is precisely in that precise moment that we appreciate the added value of superlearning because it makes possible those small progresses that can guarantee a victory or a broken record. Some researchers support the idea that the more and more complex the processing performed on information, the better it will be understood and the longer it will be retained. In particular, according to the Craik and Lockhart model, there would be 3 levels of processing that we explain below. The first level is that of linguistic perception, in which words are isolated, that is, the elements that constitute the message read or heard. The second level is that of syntactic and lexical processing, in which one tries to reconstruct the structure of the sentence. The third level, finally, is that of semantic interpretation, in which the meaning of the sentence is reconstructed. Therefore, the deeper the analysis of a text read or listened to, the more its syntactic semantic architecture is discovered. Consequently, it becomes desirable to intentionally lead the student towards deep decoding and recoding that allow him to discover the logical structure of the text and its most intimate meanings. But how? The tool that seems most suitable for the purpose is the map, that is, the grid representation of the text. In the following example, we will use a particular type of map, the textual one, but any other form of mapping would have been fine as well. Let us observe below the concretization of this work of dismantling the text and its reassembly in a reticular form so as to be able to appreciate its actual depth. These are the steps that are going to be implemented. The key words are isolated. The various conceptual nodes are progressively condensed. The cause-effect links are reconstructed. And in the end you get a synthetic network representation of the expressed meanings. Of course, providing useful tools to be able to dismantle and reassemble a text helps the student to carry out in-depth analyses and to represent the conceptual configurations discovered, but the outcome of this process still depends on the ways in which he uses these tools, that is, on the intensity and level of concentration with which he engages in the work of coding and recoding itself. Imagine someone says the word canary to you. What mental process is activated in your brain? Probably this. You will immediately see the image of a little bird, most likely yellow in color. And probably, without you being fully aware of it, a mental configuration for information retrieval has been activated that we can represent as follows. As we have seen, the presentation of a stimulus word activates a group of semantically associated information in memory, the so-called priming effect, with the aim of retrieving the requested information. However, the activation does not only affect the involved node, but also causes a consequent propagation of the activation to the surrounding areas. In fact, the propagation fully affects the nodes close to the identified one and to a lesser extent the others. It should be noted that the stronger the ties that initially connected the nodes, the higher the possibility of accessing the associated information. All these considerations have interesting implications on the educational level. If our teaching action is aimed first of all at structuring a solid network of knowledge in memory, we will subsequently be able to make virtuous use of the activation-propagation process. Through the use of activation mediators similar to those proposed in the past by Ausubel and Reigluth, we will be able to propose to the student's attention a complex of stimulus words that, through propagation and priming effect, are able to activate many groups of semantically associated nodes and carry out an almost automatic retrieval of the requested information. Popular wisdom tells us that you don't learn by magic, but you learn often with difficulty, with sacrifice, self-denial, and, above all, through memorization work that rarely flows easily and spontaneously. Even cognitive sciences say more or less the same thing, that is, that repetition and memorization are the engines of knowledge construction. This does not coincide at all with the endorsement of a mechanical process of memorization, but, on the contrary, with a conception of study that can be summarized in this formula. Do not study by heart, but use memory to study. Let's look at a selection of scientific contributions that underlie this statement. 1. The first entry of information into memory occurs during the comprehension phase, when the student makes the first encodings on the incoming data according to personal methods, that is, giving an individual imprint to the encoding of the study material. 2. One of these imprints is given by the use of coding specificity. A stimulus, associated with a certain situation, recalls the experience if it was actually present when the experience took place. Translated to the didactic level, this means that the student who underlines or highlights keywords will remember them better because he has codified them by labeling them with colors or underlines when he encountered them for the first time in the text. 3. Coding consistency is also essential. We know that, to promote good memory, it is important that the encodings required in the comprehension phase occur according to methods that will also be taken up in subsequent study phases or that, at least, do not contradict them. That is, if the teacher has introduced a topic using a graphic scheme, maintaining the scheme as the logical pivot of the explanation will promote in the students both understanding and remembering what he has said. 4. It is a certain fact that memory is not a simple duplication of experience but a re-elaboration of it, sometimes very noticeable. For example, one almost never finds an accurate reproduction of a text, but a general scheme that is outlined in the first recollection and becomes progressively more precise in the subsequent ones. This initial structure is the starting point of all the work of recollection during which the details and secondary information are then reconstructed. 5. Indeed, as various authors demonstrate, it can often happen that we remember having read or heard what the result of our own inferences is instead only. 6. However, this freedom of reconstruction also brings advantages because it means that we have the possibility to discover new knowledge, add or generate new knowledge, deduce relationships between them. 7. We know that there are short-term memories that have been studied and defined differently. Sensory memory, primary memory, short-term memory, working memory. 8. We also know that the contents of a short-term memory are lost if they are not repeated within a short time of being administered. 9. Keeping information in memory can happen in two ways. Thanks to an emotional propulsive thrust that does not require repetition. When an event or a thought is associated with emotions and sensations that are important to us, we have no difficulty remembering it. But thanks to a cognitive propulsive push that requires various repetitions. When we have to repeat a long and elaborate text, we are forced to review it several times to remember it well. The two propulsive actions have strengths and weaknesses. The first push certainly offers the advantage of reducing the effort of studying, but it is certainly not easy to always propose teaching situations full of great emotional significance. The second push, on the other hand, is certainly more tiring and, if used, shows that we are studying something that does not emotionally touch us deeply, but sometimes it is really necessary because the concepts are particularly abstract and elaborate. 10. Repeating is already in a certain sense recalling what is contained in memory. The attempt to repeat creates a path of access to the archived material. The higher the number of times that path is traveled, the more the path is paved for a subsequent retrieval. But every time you do it, it's like a rediscovery. New meanings emerge, unexpected conceptual configurations are determined, consolidated networks are systematized. And this is because memory recovery, due to the reconstructive logic that characterizes it, is an act similar to the so-called generation effect, that is, discovery. And here is a list of final indications resulting from the considerations made. Block through repetition, the physiological loss of information that characterizes the first moments of the memorization process, interrupting the indiscriminate accumulation of information destined to be forgotten, and instead subjecting it to adequate consolidation procedures before accepting other information. Implement procedures that consolidate acquired knowledge in memory, making sure that the reconstructions of what is contained in the teaching material are precise and do not produce improper or distorted meanings. Train to memorize and not just to accumulate in the memory a series of contents and verbal meanings to memorize. Make the mechanisms for retrieving stored information active and efficient. Promote long-term memorization, avoiding focusing too much on short-term memorization. A script is a basic cognitive structure that guides behaviors in similar contexts, and that is expressed in a sequence of actions carried out more or less in the same way in similar situations. Let's analyze a classic example: the script of Shank and Abelson. The script unfolds in 4 scenes which in turn contain a sequence of actions expressed in a synthetic but precise way. Scene 1. Entrance to the restaurant. Eyes on the tables. Place to sit. At the table. Sitting position. Scene 2. Ask for the menu. Read the menu. Decide what to order. Order from the waiter. Scene 3. Get food. Eat the food. Scene 4. Ask for the bill. Get the bill. Go to the checkout. Pay the bill. Leave the restaurant. When you go to a restaurant, this is what happens in broad terms. Each of us knows it, expects it, and puts it into practice, whether it is the customer, the waiter, or the owner of the restaurant. However, a script does not limit itself to orienting behavior in daily life, but also has an evolutionary function. It serves to structure the individual's semantic system and to define the conceptual categories with which his thoughts operate. In fact, by breaking down the temporal and causal sequence of a script, one becomes capable of abstracting properties, characteristics, functions of objects, and specific actions of a given event, also grasping the temporal links and causal connections. All this has obvious implications both for the growth of the person and for the repercussions on the educational formative level. We appreciate the educational potential of a script through this exercise proposed for a school text. Instructions. Read the diagram on the left that outlines a script of the historical phenomenon we call popular insurrection, and the diagram on the right that recalls 5 crucial moments of the French Revolution. Then write a short text that illustrates the facts, diagram on the right, using the script, diagram on the left. Initial situation. Excessive power of the leader or the ruling class. Abuses, bullying, lack of freedom, discomfort of the people. Intermediate situation. Exasperation of the people, stiffening of the ruling class, police interventions to stifle disagreements, escalation. Final situation. People's revolt, military repression, political upheavals, tragic events with uncertain outcomes. Now read the sequence of events that actually happened during the French Revolution. The transition from absolutism to the claims of the Third Estate, to the storming of the Bastille, to Robespierre, and finally to the phase of the Directory. At this point, provide your version of the facts in light of what the provided script suggests. On a theoretical level, it is possible to conceive the possibility of setting up personalized study paths that allow each person to learn according to their own cognitive style. Numerous experiments have highlighted the existence of particular typical perceptual behaviors that differentiate individuals from each other, especially in study and training contexts. Typically, authors polarize these behaviors by emphasizing their extremes. Let's see some examples. The implications of a possible control over cognitive styles in a teaching learning situation are considerable. In theory, each student could use learning material structured in accordance with his or her cognitive style to have a harmonious impact on what he or she has to learn. At a practical level, however, some design problems are encountered that make the effective implementation of such programs problematic. The major obstacles are due above all to the multiplicity of cognitive styles theorized by scholars, and to the objective difficulty of declining contents that are exhaustively harmonized with the reference polarizations. It is, however, realistic to think of isolating the most versatile polarizations on an operational level, such as the one called analytical style, synthetic style, and creating parallel study paths that communicate the same contents using transmission methods oriented towards analysis or synthesis. In this case, it would be conceivable to create two parallel paths, one more analytical and detailed and the other that shows the same contents at a higher level of synthesis. Furthermore, it is conceivable to have transition points between the two levels, taking into account that most people have learning styles that are located in the middle of the two extremes. Many learning problems arise simply from not knowing the right procedure to solve a problem or to perform a task. The development of adequate algorithms and their teaching can constitute an important step towards emancipation from ignorance on the part of those who, unfortunately, have not had the opportunity to know how to do a certain thing. In very general terms, an algorithm can be said to be an unambiguous prescription that provides instructions for relatively elementary operations to be used in solving problems or performing tasks. Algorithms can be classified based on their characteristics and functions. There are deterministic ones, those that provide 100% of the expected results, and probabilistic ones, those that guarantee it only in percentage, including instructional algorithms. An instructional algorithm identifies the mental processes underlying perfect execution or expert performance, and then formalizes them according to a procedural logic so that they can be communicated unambiguously to the student. The instructional algorithm does nothing but make clear the need to guarantee a fundamental right of the student, that of having precise, clear and exhaustive explanations from the teacher or from the computer program he is using. In other words, it is about providing him with those thought patterns that can guarantee him success in carrying out the tasks he must do. Let's examine an example of an algorithm applied in the linguistic field, in particular to grammar. Logical analysis is the detailed study of the proposition that is carried out by breaking down the sentence into its basic elements, words and groups of words, in order to establish the function that they perform. The analysis consists of a certain number of identification, subdivision and attribution operations to be carried out on the various syntagms contained in the sentence. The diagram shown, taken from a text in the sector, provides the sequence of operations to be implemented to carry out the analysis. It is a sort of general algorithm intended for secondary schools. Therefore, the level of detail must be referred to the type of user for whom it was intended. Anyone interested in an in-depth reading of the diagram should use the still image.